going to be talking about the big quote-unquote autism epidemic. I am. And I'm going to be explaining how there is no epidemic going on whatsoever concerning autism. First of all, I'd like to cover what even is an epidemic. According to the dictionary, an epidemic is an infectious disease on widespread in a specific area or region. So, I would like to point out first of all, as evidence, autism is not an epidemic. Autism is not in a specific area, it is global. Secondly, autism is not an infectious disease. Thirdly, autism does not spread. It's not like I throw my genes over there, but it infects the people around me. So autism doesn't even spread. The science greatly shows that autism is hereditary and primarily genetic, and nothing genetic multiplies at the so-called prevalence rate, as it's not an increase in prevalence, it's an increase of diagnosis. This quote-unquote epidemic is. So the fact it's impossible for it to be a quote-unquote genetic epidemic is enough evidence to know that it's not an epidemic. Knowing that it's not an infectious disease is enough to know it's not an epidemic. So all those claiming it's an epidemic clearly don't even know what they are talking about. So just to provide some evidence on this, let's take a look at history. When we come to psychiatry, we always say that quote-unquote disorders stem from the society itself. They do not come from biology itself. Such as, if we think about around the time of the Civil War in the US, in the 1800s, there was a quote-unquote medical disorder called drapetomania, where apparently if a slave desired to escape enslavement, they had a medical disorder. But was that ever true? No, it wasn't some medical disorder, it was a social classification. Then, what about left-handedness? Left-handedness was said to be a pathological disorder. If you just look at this chart with me, look at how quickly left-handedness is rising on this graph. Look at how quickly. Does this mean there was an epidemic of left-handedness? Just because left-handedness was on a constant rise? Well, it wasn't actually on a constant rise, was it? These people were already left-handed. It's simply that society stigmatized left-handedness. And by stigmatizing left-handedness, people were not allowed to use the left hand. So by not seeing people use the left hand, they simply thought fewer people were left-handed. Before, some people even thought about using your left hand more is satanic. Before. So, was this an epidemic just because there's a big increase? Was it prevalence or being able to identify? It was a matter of identification. Being able to recognise and identify more people were left-handed. Then once it stopped being stigmatised, more people were willing to use the left hand. And then more people willing to use the left hand, it became even less stigmatised. That eventually, if you look on the graph, it eventually settles off and flattens and stays at a constant rate. As a second example, if we think of homosexuality, homosexuality was seen as a mental illness all the way until 1973 that warranted treatment. But if you look at the graph here, this next one, is this some epidemic of homosexuality? A big increase in prevalence rates of how many people are homosexual, a reduction of how many people are heterosexual, an increase of lesbians, bisexual. Did we have some sexual orientation epidemic? No, it's simply I can recall when I was a child, people were scared to actually admit their sexual orientation. They were scared to admit if they were gay, because gay was stigmatised by society. It was. Those who were among the LGBTQ were stigmatised, discriminated, etc., bullied, and some even murdered. And it's the same case with disabled people today. But some disabled people, it's not yet been entirely unstigmatised. So once society stigmatises a group of people, society's basically created and invented a disorder altogether. And by doing so, it makes it appear that some people, that there's not as many with it because they're hiding it, doing what autistic people call masking. And so a lot of people wonder, what about this big increase in autism? It all comes down to several factors. Part is culture. What culture you live in has a big effect on how many people get diagnosed with autism. Secondly, is the increase in more research put in towards autism. Third cause is the diagnostic manuals and criteria of the changes which have occurred over the years. For example, if we think of tallness, whenever you redefine something, the quote-unquote prevalence will change. For example, imagine you had to be 7 feet to be described as tall. But then later, that's about 1 in 1 million people. But if we redefine tall as 6 feet, that comes to about 1 in 33 people. Does that mean we just had an epidemic of tallness? That humans got so much taller. More and more humans became tall. So no, it wasn't an epidemic of tallness. It wasn't an epidemic of left-handedness. It wasn't an epidemic of homosexuality. It's just simply we redefined or unstigmatized. Autism has become less stigmatized compared to the past. So more people are willing to reach out for a diagnosis. In the past, they resisted it. The criteria, we were given a warning by professors like Dr. Alan Francis, the chairman of the DSM-4 committee. We were actually given warnings by them that a nightmare would occur if they produced the DSM-5. If you just allow me to quote these on the screen. I quote, Dr. Alan Francis, chair of DSM-4 committee. DSM-5 will radically and recklessly expand the boundaries of psychiatry. There is no reason to believe that DSM-5 is safe or scientifically sound. Close quote. Precisely by the boundaries of psychiatry expanding, just as Dr. Alan Francis warned, the autism rates expanded. How many people are diagnosable expanded, not the magically turned autistic. The next one, Dr. Stephen Hyman, former NIMH director, says, DSM is totally wrong, an absolute scientific nightmare. Close quote. Just again, as it was warned that if they produce this DSM-5, it's going to be a nightmare. And hasn't this big increase of quote-unquote disorders just constantly increased diagnosis rates and it increased how many people require treatment or warrant treatment? Then don't all those organisations that give the treatment get money out of it? So where it says to be, oh, disability is a big burden, it's got a great cost. And well, when there's cost, there's also a receiver you've got to acknowledge. For example, rather than saying to the ABA therapists that Oh, this rising autism rate, it's a great cost. Oh, a great cost for the people who require service, but revenue to those who give the service. Revenue for them. It's better described as profit, as we're going to hear from Dr. Alan Francis in a minute. Then the next one, Dr. Thomas Insel, former NIMH director, says, patients deserve better. The weakness is its lack of validity. Close quote. This is what neurodiversity activists and proponents of the neurodiversity paradigm say. This whole concept of normality, being within some narrow normal range, pathologizing anyone who differs or diverges from this quote-unquote norm, apparently we see it as invalid. It's invalid to claim something's a disorder just because it's not so common, just because it's different. We don't see that as a wholesome approach to what is disability. Then Dr. Alan Francis closed on this with, I quote, there is no definition of a mental disorder. I mean, you just can't define it. It's bullshit. Dr. Alan Francis, chair of DSM-4 committee. End of quote. Right, we're just going to watch a short video of Dr. Alan Francis sharing of how ordinary human characteristics have been over-medicalized, that Big Pharma can sell more pills. So remember, the more autism diagnosis there is, and the video I did on Lou Covering, where apparently Lou Covering cures autism, according to Dr. Oz, Donald Trump, Robert Francis Kennedy. Now, how many people are going to buy Lou Covering? Isn't that a service to Big Pharma? That Big Pharma's going to get to sell more Lou Covering. It's a profit there for Big Pharma, but bankruptcy for the people who have to buy it. So there are people who do get things out of the quote-unquote cost that us autistic people are. So let's listen to Dr. Alan Francis.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, called the DSM, is a listing of mental disorders and provides definitions for each of them that are meant to guide diagnosis and therefore to influence treatment planning. The system in its current form started in 1980, before the drug companies were a major factor in selling illnesses in order to sell pills. And the system is far too loose in its definitions. So what may have made sense then, when the biggest problem in the country was underdiagnosis, no longer makes sense now when we're suffering from overdiagnosis promoted by drug company advertising. So the diagnostic system needs to be changed in the direction of narrowing, because currently it's way too loose and way too easy for people who have the normal stresses and aches and pains of everyday life to get diagnosed as having a mental disorder and get treated with a pill. The biggest problem in terms of overdiagnosis caused by the DSM system comes with depression and anxiety. Sadness and worries are very adaptive. People who can't feel sad can't love and get attached to things. People who can't worry do stupid things, puts them in danger. We can feel sad, we can feel anxious, because these helped our ancestors survive. We shouldn't confuse normal sadness and normal anxiety with mental disorder, and that line has been terribly blurred. So that many people who present to the GP feeling badly about having lost their job or feeling worried about how they're going to support their family, they're diagnosed as having a mental disorder and given a psychiatric pill. Much better to give them counseling, to have watchful waiting, to normalize their sadness or anxiety, because most people are going to get better on their own.
So what is causing this big increase of diagnosis then? As I mentioned there at the beginning, there's several factors towards it. It's not just that there's been a change of diagnostic criteria. Such as, to continue with Dr. Alan Francis' point about this being all about selling pills and so on, Professor Alicia A. Broderick writes, I quote, Grinker argues that this specific diagnosis, autism, has become deeply integrated into a financial system that relies on that diagnosis for its sustainability and growth. Building on Hacking's ideas, Grinker posits that once a diagnostic label, such as autism, becomes a focal point around which institutionalized financial activities converge, that very diagnostic category creates incentives for manufacturing people with the diagnosis, whose presence and needs support this financial infrastructure. As designed, the established reactive and medical paradigm of healthcare generates a revenue stream that encourages increasing funding for the treatment of symptoms while decreasing funding available for a social approach. End of quote. Right. So the first part is that in order for the medical paradigm to survive and continue making its profit, it needs people to be diagnosed. So they will loosen the ends of it to make more people diagnosable. And as I mentioned before, culture comes into play. In a book which I wrote, I shared that quite a lot of these psychiatric disorders are not biologically deterministic, but are more sociologically deterministic. That be a sociological constructs made out of culture. Because I point out that the whole concept is that anything which doesn't fit this quote-unquote normal gets seen as antisocial. So really, if someone's not normal, it means they are antisocial. That's what people have equated social to mean. The National Library of Medicine writes, I quote, cross-cultural studies of autism have shown that culture shapes the way families, professionals, and communities understand and treat developmental disorders. Of the developmental disorders, interpretations and treatments of autism are particularly susceptible to the influence of culture because there is no agreed upon cause for the disorder. Diagnosing autism relies heavily on behavioral criteria, and behavioral norms vary considerably across cultures. End of quote. Right, so we can see there that the diagnosis rates in different cultures will depend on cultural norms. So whatever is perceived as normal, that'll be perceived as you are not autistic, but if you're perceived as abnormal, apparently you'll be perceived as autistic. Such as, I like how Dr. Nick Walker writes it. She says, I quote, through the lens of the neurodiversity paradigm, the pathology paradigm's medicalized framing of autism and various other constellations of neurological, cognitive, and behavioral characteristics as disorders or conditions can be seen for what it is: a social construction rooted in cultural norms and social power inequalities, rather than a scientifically objective description of reality. End of quote. Yeah, I would say Nick has it right there, because cultural norms, it's if you deviate from the cultural norm, you're automatically assumed you've got a pathological disorder. And as time's gone by, the more and more the concept of normal is intensified, more and more human diversity has been seen as some kind of disease. But basically now, it could be said that human diversity and even biodiversity is now the abnormal. It's abnormal to be different, apparently. If you don't fit into this norm, apparently there's something wrong with you and you warrant treatment. So apparently everyone's got to be the same, or as Oliver Lobar said, founder of ABA, indistinguishable from their peers. You'll find that ABA is one of the biggest marketing plots that's out there, and so onto more causes of why it's increasing. If you look on this next graph, you'll see that as autism has risen, intellectual disability has gone down. Do you think that things like intellectual disability are vanishing, that they are no longer among our population, they're fading away? No, it's simply that intellectual disability has been reclassified as autism. So, where in the past someone would have been given a diagnosis of intellectual disability, today they are given a diagnosis of autism. In the past, they said you can't have ADHD and autism at the same time. So, it was either you had ADHD or autism. But they changed that rule, you can now have both. But apparently, rather than getting a diagnosis of ADHD, nearly everyone I know with ADHD is given a diagnosis of autism rather than ADHD or ADD. So, what you basically see is that in psychiatry, what's caused this big increase of diagnosis is they're reclassifying nearly every quote-unquote disorder as autism. So any diagnosis, oh, you're autistic. So that stereotype that everyone's autistic to a certain extent, the more they intensify normal and narrower they make that gap of where, oh, you're healthy, the more narrow they make that, the more the diagnosis rate's going to go up. It's all manufactured, it's all perfectly orchestrated. But as Grinker argues and points out, that they've got to keep diagnosing people in order for their organisations to survive. So, but there's going to keep being an increase of diagnoses, but in order for it to stay revolving around autism, we've got to replace intellectual disability as autism to keep it increasing. So this is nothing natural, this increase of diagnosis. It's all perfectly orchestrated altogether. So I would just like to remind you all, there's no autism epidemic. But let's just imagine for a moment there was an autism epidemic, that we actually do have an increase in prevalence, not an increase in diagnosis. So imagine there's an increase of prevalence for the moment. You know, this massive increase of prevalence. That would actually mean that the people who claim autism is the next step of evolution are more likely right. Was natural selection continuing to select the mutations that have been associated with autism? First saying there is no biomarkers, up to now there's been over 100 mutations associated with autism, found more on average in people with a formal diagnosis, and they estimate that this is just a quarter. So they think they've only found a quarter of them to do with autism. We know that it's heritable. Altogether, that's one thing which is settled within science. But they have settled the point that autism is primarily genetic and hereditary. So there's no going past that. And so what we can say is there is no epidemic. And when we look to all these quote-unquote disorders, when you trace it back when they were first identified, why are they all so close to the eugenics movement? Because it was in the 19th century when the concept of normality, that's when it was made. It's less than 200 years old. This idea that there's any such thing as a normal person. It's less than 200 years old. But it seems to have taken a great power over everyone. And so, sooner or later, I'd say people are going to have to reevaluate your values. You know, where I hear quote unquote autism mums, I was going, oh, but my child will never have independence. Independence is not shouldn't be your highest priority. Independence. Now, if we want to take a scientific approach, think about the rest of nature for a moment. Everything else in nature does not live for its own sake. The sun doesn't shine for itself. Rivers don't drink their own water. Trees don't grow fruit to eat for themselves. The wind doesn't just blow for itself. The wind blows all these dandelions across to spread them. When the population of dandelions can multiply and replenish. So nothing out there in nature is living for itself or living by itself in an isolated way. So what makes humans an exception? Are we actually supposed to be living for ourselves? Or should we actually be in this world for others around us? Be here for one another as an interdependent species, as a social species, not people who isolate themselves and think it's better to be isolated. That is actually very unhealthy. But this tends to be in Western cultures. Such in my culture, we tend to have a collective culture rather than an individualistic culture. So if you think independence should be the highest priority, I invite you to rethink about your values of, is that really the way to happiness and joy? Independence. Because I know many people who are not independent, but they're very happy and joyful. I don't have full independence, but I love my life. So is independence really a requirement for a joyful life? I would say not. What actually does make life miserable is when you put yourself at the centre. When someone puts themselves at the centre of their life, basically, you've got nothing to die for. And if you've got nothing to die for, that also means you've got nothing to live for, either. The people who enjoy life the most are the people who subject themselves to a greater cause, to something greater and more important than themselves. They don't tend to all this selfishness. But I see all these autism mums screaming out, oh, there's this big epidemic. All this propaganda. Demonising their own kids, dehumanising autistic people. Going and claiming that autism, a fundamental aspect of who we are, is a disease by claiming it's an epidemic, an infectious disease. You're basically claiming that our lives have no worth. We are worthless. So your actions are louder than your words. So if you're one of these autism mums screaming out for a cure all the time, scream the propaganda it's an epidemic, make sure you acknowledge what your actions are actually saying. Don't think your kids can't understand you. There's a significant reason why autistic kids are over 10 times more likely to commit suicide. Guess which ones it usually is? The ones who have parents who are consistently saying around the kids that their kids are burden, that their child's autism, oh, it's so devastating and life-destroying. You go putting all this shame on your children by claiming they're an epidemic, claiming they're an infectious disease, and that they're causing your family trouble, destroying your family. Those of you who are autism mums are full of this crap that it's a big epidemic, that it's an infectious disease. You should be ashamed of yourselves for saying this about your own children. And those of you who are anti-vaxxers spreading the bullshit that vaccines cause autism. Those of you claiming that vaccines cause autism, you can never answer my question. We know that autism begins development within the womb. Do you vaccinate a fetus or an embryo? No. So autism cannot be the reaction of a vaccine. And then that indicates even more devastating things about your attitude towards your own children. Those who are anti-vaxxers. Since children can actually die from these diseases, such as the measles, mumps, rubella, polio, etc., the whooping cough, we've had so many deaths this year, since you wouldn't give your children a vaccine, that indicates you think it's worth letting your child die rather than taking the risk of having an autistic child. So you're indicating that it's better to have a dead child than to have an autistic child. So just as Jim Sinclair said, I'd say he said it the perfect way. When someone asks for a cure for autism, or when a parent says, I wish my child did not have autism, what they are actually saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist. I wish I had another non-autistic child instead. James Sinclair put it perfectly. He did, all the way back in 1993. So anti-vaxxers claiming vaccines cause autism, autism mums and dads claiming autism's an epidemic, big celebrities claiming, oh, autism is this devastating thing. You're the ones doing more harm than what autism does. So I'll say it one last time. There is no epidemic, and watch your language of how you talk about autistic people. If you've listened for this far, thank you for listening, and please may you subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this content.